So Menachem, thank you so much and welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me. This is great. This is really exciting. What an
So
honor.
I know you wrote a book. Tell us a little bit about your book and some of the work that you do.
Okay, so I actually wrote two books. The first one is called Stepping Out of the Abyss. It's a Jewish guide to the 12 steps. And the other one is called Consciously, which is a book on utilizing mindfulness and meditation practices to evolve and develop a vibrant conscious contact, which is a recovery term for like a relationship with God.
Mhm.
So the work that I do is I work with youth 18 to 35 who are emerging out of substance abuse treatment centers, and they're trying to build a life. And we try to help them with all the different aspects of that. That includes, spirituality, as maybe we'll talk about, has a big part of recovery, and particularly in the 12-step approach. But generally as well. And therefore, sometimes includes enhancing their spirituality and their connection to Judaism and finding a place within Judaism, but also helping them, get their lives, the jobs, whatever, school, life. We have young couples that are part of our program, helping navigate that, all those kind of things.
So talk to me a little about the spirituality piece, because I think that's something that at least perked my ears as soon as you said it, which is and people we've heard this from different people, how spirituality plays a role. So give us a little bit more as to what does spirituality do during this process for somebody.
Okay, so to really kind of touch on the spirituality piece, what's most effective is to kind of give you a little bit of a historical kind of context. So obviously, addiction affects a person psychologically, but also um, physically. People become physically dependent on addiction. But something that emerged in the early part of the 20th century was an idea that there was actually an existential or spiritual part of addiction that was driving people back into addictive patterns, meaning you'd have treatment where someone would fall into an addictive pattern, they become addicted to alcohol or drugs or some other addiction, and then they'd go for treatment and they'd be their addiction would be relieved, they would be removed from their addiction, and then they would fall back into that pattern again and again and again. And no one really understood for a very long time. And then there was a kind of an event or a series of events that occurred in the early part of the 20th century that culminated ultimately in the development of the 12 steps through the Alcoholics Anonymous program, which is the first 12-step program. And now there's hundreds of 12-step programs, but based on an idea that was put forward by Carl Jung, right, the famous Carl Jung, was that the reason why addicts and alcoholics continue to fall into a pattern of addiction is because they're actually seeking in their addiction something other than relief from their dependency and even relief from their emotional problems. And there's some kind of spiritual angle, there was some kind of spiritual drive. So that if they were to utilize spiritual practices and help a person evolve and create a healthy and vibrant spirituality, it would act as a guard against further relapse. It would actually act as a support while somebody was seeking their initial recovery. And it would give them a vibrant and meaningful life and help them to kind of lead a really meaningful existence. So, and the 12 steps are really just developed out of that idea. The forebearers of the 12 steps, the early members of Alcoholics Anonymous, basically started to adapt different things that different people were doing, in particular one group, the Oxford group, but others as well, which are spiritual practices. How a person can develop and evolve, have a spiritual awakening, that's a term that they use, and then develop a very vibrant spiritual life. And that whole movement is based on that.
So since this is the Shabbat show and we are, I guess, sort of focused in on Jewish practice and Jewish principles, being someone like yourself, tell us, if you can, how that sort of general spiritual focus, is it in line with Judaism? Is it something that is very much a part of Jewish practice? Is it something that we've known already, but we didn't really connect the dots until recently?
So one of the things that's interesting is that Carl Jung on his 80th birthday was interviewed, and he said that if you want to know someone that anticipated my entire psychology, you will find it in Rav Dov Ber of Mezrich, the great Maggid of Mezrich, one of the leaders of the Hasidic movement. So even that Carl Jung said, we can find rooted in Judaism, perhaps we could say, at least in Carl Jung's report. But more importantly, the idea that there's multifarious kind of drives which lead us to kind of dark spaces, is not something that's new in Judaism. And the fact that one of those drives is one that's spiritual and one that's rooted in a lack of a relationship with God and a lack of a vibrant sense of meaning and purpose is not a new idea in Judaism. That's like fundamental to the entire idea of Judaism. But the idea that we could utilize and leverage a relationship with God to emerge out of the darkness of an abyss of addiction is not something that's contrary to Judaism at all. It's, in fact, it's very, very much related. One of the other things to keep in mind, and then perhaps we could focus on maybe some of the principles of recovery that are obviously connected to Judaism. I kind of wrote some down. I thought perhaps that might be useful, is that the recovery programs, and specifically the 12-step programs, really focused on what works. So what they weren't being driven by ideology. It was driven by trial and error. So the fact, this is something I say to Jewish people all the time, the fact that they came out with something that actually is totally in line with Judaism is not surprising, because the Torah is true. So it makes sense that what they did was true. They weren't driven by a Christian ideology or any other ideology. They weren't driven even by a psychological ideology. They just were trying things to figure out what would work and what would give them a vibrant relationship with God. And what they ended up with is, in fact, very much connected to Judaism. My first book, Stepping Out of the Abyss, which I wrote with Aryeh Buxbayev, and Rabbi Yoni Feiner actually wrote a section on Judaism and recovery, highlights a lot of these things. And Rabbi Abraham Tursky, be remiss not to mention him at all. He's the grandfather of Jewish recovery, has highlighted, 100 times, 1,000 times, the connectedness. But some of the really meaningful principles that I kind of jotted down here was that, first of all, the entire basis of the recovery program and the process of incorporating spirituality into recovery from addiction is based on the principle of acceptance, right? It's a very, very powerful principle. Today, it's become recognized as a powerful psychological principle, but acceptance, at least especially as it's practiced through the 12 steps, is really what we in Judaism called emunah or bitachon, right? Which is faith and trust, but specifically faith and trust that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, that the challenges that I'm having are one that I'm, so to speak, destined for, and that God wants me to operate from here. It's like there's a reading in the main text of Alcoholics Anonymous, a story of a doctor who kind of came to the conclusion that, and he said that acceptance was the key to his recovery from his alcoholism, because he came to the conclusion, he said, I'm an alcoholic, what am I going to do about it now? So instead of kind of fighting against that tide and trying to avoid that fact, by accepting that fact, that was a springboard towards moving forward. And that's in the foundation of step one. But there's a spiritual side of that, because it means I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. As long as a person feels like they're not where they're supposed to be, they're always kind of feeling like they should be somewhere else. And the foundation of the recovery program, and this is oftentimes a foundation in Emunah, is like, I am exactly where I'm supposed to be. I'm in Egypt. I'm in the darkness. I'm surrounded by servitude and slavery and what we call shibud, and God can reach his hand in and help me, as we did in literally in the story of Egypt. God, he did not send an angel, he did not send a messenger, he himself came down. That principle, but that the suffering has meaningfulness and purposefulness, is a very Jewish idea. Another idea is that honesty is the key, and we know that our tradition tells us that the seal of God is truth and honesty. And what they found in the recovery program is that the key to recovery from addiction is to learn how to be honest, not only with other people, but with ourselves, right? The foundation of the whole thing is to learn how to be honest with ourselves, to be honest with God, to be honest with others. And that is the principle of the whole thing. Self-reflection and inventory is part of that honesty process. A healthy process of self-reflection and inventory is a vital part of the recovery process. And that is a vital part of Judaism, right? We call cheshbon hanefesh, but not like a critical kind of destructive form of beating ourselves up, but really a vibrant way of kind of looking at what reality is and what we can do better. And then finally, the linchpin of the whole recovery program is service, chesed, right? That is the foundation of the whole thing. And not only that, but that chesed is the main pathway to invite God into our lives. The key in Judaism, the way that we put a prominence on kindness, tikkun olam, but also doing kindness, but also charity. Charity is, the Jewish people are of the, charity is like, it's in our blood. But the foundation is that when we make ourselves channels of goodness, of charity, it opens the door for us to recover from our most pervasive challenges. And that's at the core of the recovery process.
Amazing. Menachem, thank you so much for joining us today and for all the work that you do for the community and for the world at large. And thank you for shining your light on this world.
No, thank you so much, Charlie. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks so much for watching. For more content, like and subscribe, and be sure to tune in live every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern at theshabbatshow.com or right here on YouTube.